Hey, everybody. Welcome to Shortcut U's first ever podcast. I recently sat down with Dr. Milo Wolf, PhD in sports science from Solent University, who is an expert in range of motion, which can be simplified to whether you're completing full repetitions, moving the weight through the entirety of the range of motion available to you, or some form of partial repetitions where you're only moving the weight through a portion of the range of motion available to you, and whether one form of range of motion or the other is better for building muscle and increasing strength. I had a lot of fun talking with Milo. We not only went through a lot of practical applications of this research, but went off on a couple of cool tangents. One talking about statistics and him giving a little bit of a breakdown for the lay population for things like p-values and statistical significance and stuff like that. One cool thing about Milo is that he's not only a researcher who spends a lot of time in the lab and reading through papers, he also is a bodybuilder himself and has a pretty impressive physique. So he not only talks the talk, but walks the walk in this regard. Anyways, without further ado, here's my conversation with now Dr. Milo Wolf. All right, now Dr. Milo Wolf, thanks for meeting with me. How does it feel to say doctor now? I know I've seen in a lot of videos you opened with soon to be doctor, and I know you've probably been thinking about your PhD for a little while. How does it feel to finally have that accolade?
Man, I'm torn. So on the one hand, I do try and say at the start of videos so that people can have an idea that I'm not just talking out of my ass. But equally, I don't really like appeals to authority, so it's kind of like an odd feeling. But overall, I'm just happy I'm done with the process, to be honest. It was a long 3 years, and at times a very effortful 3 years. So, just grateful to be done with it and to have achieved it, I guess.
Right, yeah, with the calls to authority, I know you're probably used to seeing, like, I don't know if you're familiar with Lane Norton, but talking about, MDs and stuff, just talking about things they really know nothing about, but getting away with it because they have that title at the front of their name.
Yeah, man, it's that annoying thing where, on average, if someone has a PhD or is an MD or what have you, the quality of their information will be better. So I think it is overall a good thing that people mention it when they have one. But equally, it doesn't preclude them from being wrong. And I think when the perception arises that, hey, this guy's a doctor, Dr. Milo Wolf now, he can't be wrong, that ain't so good.
Right, yeah. Well, speaking of your PhD, you did your dissertation or defense on long length partials or just range of motion in general. I'd like to talk to you about a bunch of things, but we can start there since that's kind of your expertise. Where did you get the idea of starting to look into that, and maybe just like what's kind of the history of range of motion and what would be the best for strength and hypertrophy?
Yeah, great question. So what got me into range of motion to begin with is I have been lifting for about 10 years now, and at the time of finishing my undergrad in sports science, I was thinking about a lot of things. I was working in some capacity professionally as a coach, and I was also working for Renaissance periodization a little bit. Nothing too major, but just some kind of on-the-side work. And one of their big recommendations at the time, and the reason they created a team for range of motion, was that they thought that full range of motion was best for hypertrophy. Now, this was back in 2020 when I was applying for a PhD, and there had just been a paper released by Brad Schoenfeld summarizing the existing literature on range of motion and how that impacts hypertrophy. And as it turns out, the evidence wasn't quite as extensive as I had thought in support of full range of motion over a partial range of motion. Specifically, the paper summarized that there had been 6 studies comparing a partial range of motion and a full range of motion during resistance training and looking at hypertrophy. Now, just to summarize real quick what partial and full range of motion means, in case anyone's not aware, whenever you're doing a movement in the gym, you have several choices to make. How many reps, how many sets, what movement, etc. On a given movement, once you've selected all those things, you also have the decision to make of how much movement do I actually want to go through, right? If, for example, you're doing a bicep curl, do you want to go through the maximum amount of movement at the elbow joint, getting a full extension of the elbow at the bottom and a full stretch on the biceps, and then going all the way up to get a full squeeze or peak contraction on the biceps, getting your elbow fully bent? Or do you want to curtail that range of motion somewhat at the joints involved in that exercise? That would be a partial range of motion if you choose to omit a certain part of the range of motion. Now, it was assumed, based on the studies that had come out to that point, that a full range of motion was best for hypertrophy amongst many of the evidence-based crowd, I would say. Because at the time, that did seem to be the case. When you just looked at each individual study that existed of the 6, most of the time you found a benefit in favor of full range of motion for hypertrophy compared to partial range of motion. So that's kind of what prompted me to start my PhD. Is I had a personal interest in it, being a lifter and a coach myself and working for Renaissance Periodization, who commonly recommended full range of motion, and also wanting to do a PhD and realizing that that area of evidence was missing quite a few studies. And so I got started. About a year into my PhD is when I first got the results of my meta-analysis, which has now been seen and read by a fair amount of people. And to be honest, when I first got the results, I was quite taken aback because I wasn't expecting it. As I said, my bias going into my PhD, if anything, was that full range of motion was likely to be superior for hypertrophy. And so when I got the results and found a few things, that kind of took me aback. I was just surprised. And I remember messaging a client, for example, saying, this can't be right. Like something ain't right here. Like I wasn't expecting these results, and taking a few days to digest it. But the surprising things were as follows. First, previous systematic reviews and meta-analyses, of which there were now 2 at the time, had found a benefit in favor of full range of motion for hypertrophy, and that difference seemed relatively large. In fact, a bit too large to be plausible in some regards. Because when we're talking about most more influential variables, like, for example, how close to failure you train, how much volume you do, things that are really pivotal in terms of how much hypertrophy you see, it was actually almost larger than those differences, which struck me as a bit odd. And so when I got my meta-analysis, one thing that surprised me a little bit, but not entirely, was that the differences were much smaller in scale. Because there have been more studies since these papers have been published, and because previous papers had only included a certain subset of data. Specifically, for example, the meta-analysis by Palaris and colleagues had only included hypertrophy studies looking at the lower body. And the lower body is notorious for using the squat, for example, right? Where you're almost always comparing a full range of motion squat to a partial, which is usually a half squat, right? So we're comparing a full range of motion to something called a short muscle length partial, because you're essentially doing a partial range of motion, but you're not doing it in the middle or at the bottom position where your quads are stretched. You're doing it where your quads and glutes are shortened. And so when I got the results and realized that for most outcomes, like hypertrophy, like strength, like power, like sport outcomes, the difference between full range of motion and partial range of motion was actually statistically trivial or just quite small in magnitude, I was surprised. That being said, when you just broke it down into full range of motion and partial range of motion, a full range of motion tended to be slightly better for most things than partial range of motion. However, the interesting findings for me were the following. First, I suspected this already, and this is the case for many other things, but strength gains or performance gains in, for example, your sprint speed or, for example, your squat or your bench are range of motion specific. So if you train in a specific range of motion, that is the range of motion you will see the greatest improvement in. So if you want to get better at your squat to parallel in powerlifting, you should be doing most of your squatting to just parallel, and that will maximize the gains you see in your powerlifting squat. The same goes for the bench, the same goes for the deadlift. Strength gains and performance gains are range of motion specific. It's the same for example, whether you use free weights or machines, or whether you lift heavy or light. You will generally see that those adaptations are specific to the modality used, so free weights or machine, to the range of motion used, to the contraction type, the rep range, to the load used, to a lot of things. Range of motion just seems to be, based on the results here, also one of those things where if you want the best gains, you've got to train the range of motion of your outcome. The final finding, which I think has been the most publicized and also to an extent the most surprising for me, was the impact of muscle length on hypertrophy. So when you simply dichotomize range of motion into being either partial or full, so either maximal or not maximal, submaximal in some regard, you see that full range of motion does slightly outperform partial range of motion for muscle growth. However, when you then break down partial range of motion further into whether it was performed at longer average muscle lengths or shorter average muscle lengths compared to a full range of motion, you see that the picture kind of changes. Specifically, when the partial range of motion is performed at shorter muscle lengths, it is certainly worse, or very likely worse, than full range of motion for hypertrophy. However, when the partial range of motion is performed at longer average muscle lengths, so on average, you are at a longer muscle length during that partial range of motion than you are during a rep of full range of motion, you potentially saw more hypertrophy doing those partial reps. And at the time, there wasn't a ton of evidence to go off of in this analysis. There was a lot of studies comparing shortened partials or short muscle length partials to full range of motion. As I said, a lot of sports science studies use the squat, for example, where if you're doing partials, your first inclination is to compare a full range of motion squat to a partial, and the partial being like a half squat or a quarter squat, right? So that would be an example of comparing a full range of motion to a shortened partial. However, there hadn't been nearly as many studies comparing a lengthened partial to a full range of motion. And so when you simply dichotomized things into partial versus full range of motion, because there were many more studies using short muscle length partials, that inherently biased full range of motion to win, if that makes sense. So there were only 3 studies at the time comparing lengthened partials to full range of motion and looking at hypertrophy. So not a ton of data to go off of, which meant that I kind of had to look at the broader evidence to see whether or not there might be a precedent for this sort of thing, or whether there's a broader principle at play that is also evident in other bodies of evidence. And it turned out to be the case. So we have now about 9 studies comparing, for example, the same range of motion, the same partial range of motion, simply performed at different muscle lengths. So for example, one study used the leg curl. When you're doing a leg curl, you could either do it on a seated leg curl machine or on a lying leg curl machine. Because the hamstrings also insert at the hip, if you're seated, your hamstrings are more lengthened. If you're lying down, like on a lying leg curl, your hamstrings are more shortened. And so in this study, for example, the range of motion at the knee was the same. So I think they performed 90 degrees of knee flexion. However, the muscle length was different because one used a seated leg curl and one used a lying leg curl. And there have been about 9 studies using a similar design now. And across those 9 studies, 8 have found a benefit in favor of longer muscle length partials over shorter muscle length partials. Likewise, in the isometric training literature, there are now 5 studies comparing short muscle length isometrics to longer muscle length isometrics. And isometrics, for anyone who's not clear, are just contractions where muscle length isn't changing. Kind of like a wall sit, for example, where you're not really moving, you're just contracting and staying at a consistent muscle length. And when you compare short muscle length isometrics to long muscle length isometrics, you again consistently see that long muscle length isometrics seem better for hypertrophy. And so when you add that to the idea that full range of motion is also better than short muscle length partials, right? And that long muscle length partials are potentially better than full range of motion, the broad principle across like 4 bodies of evidence that long muscle length training is probably better for growth than short muscle length training seemed extremely consistent across about 20 or 25 studies now. And in fact, since the publication of this meta-analysis, there have been 2 more studies, so there were 3 before, there are now 5, comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion and measuring hypertrophy. Now, one of those 2 new studies has not been published. It has only been presented at a conference. The other one has been published. But we now have 5 studies. Out of those 5 studies comparing lengthened partials to a full range of motion, 4 have found a benefit in terms of hypertrophy to using lengthened partials, and 1 has found no difference. So it seems likely at this point that at least within these studies, in the context of the population studied, the muscle groups and what have you, it's quite likely that lengthened partials lead to more growth than full range of motion. Or at the very least, it won't lead to worse growth. That seems overwhelmingly likely.
Gotcha. Yeah, so when I was looking through your systematic review and then a lot of those few randomized controlled trials, in particular a couple that looked at full, lengthened, and shortened partials all in the same study, one thing I found interesting was the full range of motion didn't give results in between or perfectly in between lengthened and shortened as I kind of would have expected, because it seems like it's sort of halfway there. Was there anything you found interesting by that where there was really a trivial difference between full and shortened, where if you ask, Dr. Mike Urzatell or people at Renaissance Periodization, they seem to think there'd be a huge difference there. And of course, they're also training full ROM a little bit different because they really emphasize the lengthened portion of the full range of motion. But anyways, is there anything you found interesting there where there was only a small difference, or I guess technically trivial, between full range and shortened partials, but then a bigger difference, like kind of disproportionately between the lengthened partials and shortened partials?
Yeah, so for it's worth, I'm not super confident that it isn't like a roughly linear relationship where full range of motion is kind of in the middle. It may or may not be, ultimately, with any study, and even with, we now have, I think, about 5 to 10 studies thereabouts. I couldn't give you an exact number comparing full range of motion to shortened partials, but even with that number of studies, we couldn't entirely dismiss noise. And so I think it's going to be roughly linear between shortened partials being kind of the worst for hypertrophy, full range of motion kind of being in the middle roughly, and lengthened partials being slightly better for hypertrophy than full range of motion. And in terms of order of magnitude, we're talking about maybe like a 10% difference going from shortened partials to full range of motion, and another roughly 10% difference going from full range of motion to lengthened partials. Now, what I found surprising was, just that the finding existed altogether. As I said, it took me a few days to fully digest. Like, I thought that full range of motion was going to be best. I thought that I was almost doing the PhD as an exercise in contributing to science, even if I thought I already kind of knew the answer, But in reality, that didn't turn out to be the case. What I found surprising was the effect on regional hypertrophy as well. So as I mentioned, there's other bodies of evidence where lengthened training seems better for hypertrophy, but that wasn't the only finding. The other finding was that hypertrophy was specifically greater mostly in more distal areas of a muscle. So if you break down hypertrophy, not just in how much did my biceps grow as a whole, but in how did different areas of my bicep grow, or different regions, then you see that generally more distal areas of a muscle grow specifically more during longer muscle length training compared to shorter muscle length training. And that was kind of surprising. It's not something we understand fully yet, but it is worth paying attention to. I think the general reception to this phenomenon has been interesting as well online, because there are many variables we have far less evidence for that people are very happy to speculate about or speak about with a lot of confidence. But then for some reason, when it comes to range of motion, there's been, and I understand because ultimately practice is like in the gym, there is partly just attachment to what you've been doing for a while, but there has been a relatively big sort of pushback of, full range of motion is best because, I don't know, our bodies were designed that way, or other fallacies. But it's been interesting to see the response there.
Yeah, going along with that pushback, when I listened to like Dr. Mike talk about how he was really pro full ROM and still is, a lot of the times he was suggesting people go full ROM, or suggesting it to people who were skipping out on the lengthened portion. It wasn't that they were skipping out on the shortened portion of the movement. It was the lengthened because, like in a bench press, for example, that deep stretch at the bottom is what makes it particularly difficult. And it also limits the amount of weight you use. So ego probably comes in somewhere in there. And I think even skipping out on the shortened the shortened portion of the movement, also there's probably some ego in there where someone's like, oh, that's not a real rep. But in reality, unless you're training for powerlifting specifically, where you need to lock out the rep, if you're just looking to get stronger and build more muscle, the real reps that count aren't necessarily what matters. It's like the stimulus you're imposing.
I agree wholeheartedly. I think for a long time, there was an attachment to whatever range of motion, and this is still the case for the general population, I think, to some extent, is that people don't like to use a range of motion that makes them use less weight, right? But now, in the evidence-based space, I think people don't like to switch to a new range of motion if it looks different than the full range of motion standard that they now deem aesthetically pleasing, or how do you? Like, it's almost like, with the creation of Team Full ROM to an extent, I think people have fetishized full range of motion a little bit. Ultimately, I just see range of motion as something you should manipulate to get the best growth, not something you should categorically aim for one kind of range of motion,
Right. And going back to what you said about the magnitude of difference, and I give you credit, you haven't really over-exaggerated how much people will gain from using the lengthened partials. I will say, the 5 to 10% difference doesn't seem like that much on like a month-to-month basis or a year-to-year basis. But if you're talking people who are training for, 20 years or, sort of optimizing their natural, like, genetic limit, I mean, 5 to 10% on 20 pounds, 30 pounds of muscle across a lifetime is kind of a big deal, especially from like a longevity perspective. And you're thinking about, people losing whatever the number is, 1% of muscle per year once you hit a certain age or something like that. It could be kind of significant down the line. I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
I have thought about it. I think that ultimately, I do think range of motion plays second fiddle to bigger things like volume and relative intensity. But I do think that for a lot of people, even 5 or 10% can be meaningful, because in this case, unlike volume, where you have to spend sometimes double the time in the gym for maybe like 25 to 50% more growth, In this case, you're not extending how much time you spend in the gym. You're maybe not even extending how much effort you put into each set. You're just potentially getting more growth for no real cost. Yeah, sure, there's a bit of a cost to adopting something new, right? Like you have to change your practices a little bit. It takes you a while to figure out. You have to be more conscious of it and what have you. You have to learn, and that's something people don't like sometimes. But ultimately, the cost is minimal, and you see more growth. And I think that 5 or 10% for someone who is interested in optimizing growth is very meaningful. Now, the good news is that because we're talking about relatively smaller differences here, if someone was just like, look, I don't care about the details, I just want to get in the gym like 2 or 3 times a week and make some gains, and that they really don't have time to educate themselves, they will still make gains whatever range of motion they use. Whether they lock out or not, whether they get a full stretch or not, they will still make gains. But for those of us who want to optimize growth, this is a cool strategy.
Right. And I don't know how you feel about this, but I think even beyond the hypertrophy benefits, there's a big benefit you're missing out on if you're not getting to those deep end ranges of motion, either in full ROM or using lengthened partials, which is the range of motion benefits from a flexibility perspective. I heard you on another podcast talk about how you feel like you can get deeper into movements. How does that, I mean, because you were using full ROM before and getting pretty deep into movements there. Do you feel anecdotally like you've made some significant progress only using lengthened partials?
I would say honestly, I have gotten more flexible. I think there are movements where I'm almost freakishly flexible nowadays. Like dips, for example. I posted a video on tricep training a couple days ago, and I've gotten quite a few comments on how deep my dips are. I think that applies also to like other movements. One thing I've been doing, for example, recently is doing lengthened partials on the hip adduction machine. So never getting to the sort of shortened position, just getting that deep stretch in my hip adductors, that sort of the inner thigh. And that, I think I've become substantially more flexible through, for example, in hip adduction or abduction, range of motion rather. If you look at the evidence specifically though, comparing stretching, so static stretching interventions and lifting weights, they seem to both result in meaningful and actually comparable improvements in flexibility. And when you're thinking about what sort of exercise or positions lead to improvements in flexibility, it is the positions involved in lengthened partials, not so much the positions involved in shortened partials. And so even the sport-specific argument to me, in certain cases, so some people say, well, you should use full range of motion if you're an athlete because it covers your sport better, right? The reality is, for a lot of sports, you're never getting close to like a full lockout or a full stretch, right? And certain sports, you're getting only a full stretch. Like, for example, I'm not claiming to have much experience or expertise here, but I have done a few sessions of jiu-jitsu, right? And most of the time, if you're in a bad spot, it's because you're in a very lengthened position, like you're getting armbarred or what have you, like, and you need to get out of that position. You need to be strong in that lengthened position. And so for certain sports, it might actually make more sense to do lengthened partials because they allow you to get stronger in that position. And so I think the sport-specific argument may or may not apply, but I think the assumption that full range of motion is always going to be best there is probably also wrong.
Gotcha. Yeah, another kind of sport example I was thinking of that's a little bit unique is like professional arm wrestling, where there are positions where like there's something called the King's move, where pretty much they extend their arm all the way down and like kind of drop back behind the table. I don't know if you've ever seen, but it's like the complete lengthened position for your bicep. But then they're also, like, if you watch the way they train, they'll do curls where they never even, I mean, I don't even know if their arm reaches 90 degrees sometimes. But
yeah,
on the actual table, they do have to be strong in that position. So I don't know.
It's crazy with arm wrestling there, but because I feel as though, and this is as a brief and casual spectator, I feel as though the vast majority of the positions are like very shortened. And so their training kind of makes sense in the gym, although it sometimes looks a bit funny when they're cheat curling 315, you know. But then, yeah, if you have positions like the King's move where you're just absolutely lengthening the shit out of your biceps, yeah, you probably still want to do some lengthen training in there, if only for potential injury prevention. That is probably one of the main roles in a lot of sports of strength and conditioning work, is just to expose yourself to different positions and grow a little bit more injury resilient. And then for certain sports like rugby or arm wrestling, actually building muscle probably makes a lot more sense there as well, or is more important. But for a lot of sports, I think it's just down to, hey, go do some weight training, make yourself more injury resilient, and call it a day.
Yeah. Speaking of injury resilience, have you heard of the knees over toes guy?
I have heard of him. I haven't consumed much of his content, but the name kind of speaks for itself.
Right. So a lot of his content, I'm not sure how many people have connected the dots here. A lot of his content, without him specifically talking about lengthened partials, highlights the idea of lengthened partials for injury resistance. He calls it like bulletproofing your joints. And I think sort of the baseline idea is that at end ranges of motion is where we can be most vulnerable to injury in sport and stuff. And so people will avoid those end ranges of motion. I remember even in like gym class growing up, they'd say, don't let your knees go over your toes in a squat or a lunge. But if we never train those positions, then when we inevitably meet those positions in life or in sport, then we're definitely going to be at a high risk of injury versus if we train in those positions safely, we can, become more, not only gain more control in those positions from like a muscular perspective, but potentially, thicken ligaments and tendons. I don't know if you've thought about that at all.
I have. Now, I gotta give a huge caveat with what I'm about to say just because I'm not an expert in injury stuff. I do think your body tends to adapt to whatever you expose it to. The main thing is just going to be exposing it to a variety of stimuli that you're likely to expect, right? Personally, as I said, I've been doing exclusively lengthened partials for like a year now, right? Essentially. I don't think that omitting the shortened position is going to make me much more likely to get injured, just because like the forces nowadays, having been training for 10 years, the forces I expose myself to, even during warm-ups, are probably larger than anything I'll ever encounter during daily life. So unless I was now going to start training a different sport, where I might start incorporating some more general training, I don't know if range of motion plays a huge role. But yeah, if like play soccer or what have you, yeah, you might want to train in a variety of range of motion just in case someone tackles you and you end up going in a weird direction. But yeah, I agree.
Gotcha. Back to some actually more specific research for a moment here. We looked at your systematic review, meta-analysis, which correct me if I'm wrong, but the power of a meta-analysis is you can take a bunch of data points and put them together, so you have just greater data to look at, especially in exercise science. This is important because a lot of studies have pretty small subject numbers. But at the same time, you could run into issues where by combining these studies, you're sacrificing some amount of specificity. I remember, so I did some research just looking at stuff on artificial sweeteners. And so they use meta-analyses, put all these studies together. But when you go through them, like there are meta-analyses looking at people taking pills of stevia and seeing how it affects weight loss. And they're throwing that in with other studies where people are actually adding artificial sweeteners to try to reduce calories. But anyway, my point is you have to sacrifice some amount of specificity when you're using your inclusion criteria, or else you won't have many studies to add. Are there any takeaways you have from individual studies that were in your meta-analysis that have more specific transferable, designs? One in mind for me was I think it was Cassiano, the calf training one, and then also Pedrosa seemed pretty realistic for how people would train versus, I think it's pronounced Workhausen, was, seriously reduced range of motion. It was only like 10 degrees of movement on the leg press, and they weren't using eccentrics.
I see you've done your reading.
Yeah, anyway, I'll let you take it away.
Hey, you've done your reading. Respect. So I would say certain studies are going to be more applicable than others, and I think certain ones might, if you read them as opposed to just quantitatively synthesize them, you might arrive or glean certain findings that you otherwise would miss. So one thing, for example, is many studies don't truly look at the longest possible muscle lengths that you can achieve, right? Like, for example, many of the squat studies that compare a quarter squat or a half squat to a full range of motion squat, technically they're squatting to just below parallel usually in the full range of motion squat. For a lot of people, especially you and I imagine, we can get deeper into a squat than just tiny bit below parallel. And so it's not really answering the question of should we squat all the way down, or is just squatting most of the way down sufficient for hypertrophy? And I think that's where a couple of studies come in handy. So you mentioned the Cassiano study. To clarify, that's a study where they performed calf raises on a leg press machine, and there were 3 groups. One group did 4 range of motion calf raises, I believe 50 degrees of range of motion. One group did the top half, so 25 degrees of range of motion in the shortened position. And then the last group did lengthened partials, doing the bottom 25 degrees of ankle plantar flexion. And this study is interesting for a couple reasons. One, it included all 3 sort of configurations of range of motion, so full range of motion, lengthened partials, and shortened partials. And 2, more importantly for me, it placed the gastroc in a pre-stretched position because the knee was already extended, which means that because the gastroc is both a knee flexor and an ankle plantar flexor, when the knee is extended, that stretches the gastroc. In all 3 groups, the knees were extended as they are during a leg press calf raise. And so in all 3 conditions, the gastroc should have been at least reasonably lengthened, right? They should have been trained at pretty long muscle lengths already. However, in the study, despite the fact that all 3 groups, even the shortened partials group, were training at least at like moderate muscle lengths, right? Moderate to long even, they still saw more hypertrophy, broadly speaking, in the lengthened partials group, definitely compared to the shortened partials group at both sites of measurement, and at one site compared to the 4 range of motion group. And so even when you're comparing sort of long-ish muscle lengths to longer muscle lengths to maximal muscle lengths, right? It seems like there is a dose response where getting a deeper stretch past just a relatively good stretch seems even better for hypertrophy. And so it's not just get to reasonably long muscle lengths. It may actually be that if you want the best hypertrophy, you want to get to maximal muscle lengths. Now, this is relatively speculative because we don't have many studies going all the way to maximum muscle lengths for a given muscle, but it was interesting in that it showed this. And I think that can kind of also be seen in some other studies, like not now comparing partial range of motion to full range of motion, but a study by Milo and colleagues, for example, in the hamstrings, where again they compared a seated leg roll to a lying leg roll by flexing the hips and getting, I think, a full lockout at the knees at the top. They were lengthening the hamstrings a ton. They were being lengthened pretty close to maximally at both the knees and the hips, and they saw more hypertrophy compared to like getting a decent, like moderate muscle length stimulus in the lying leg curl. And so there is some indication that you don't just want long muscle lengths, but the longest possible muscle lengths when doing lengthened partials. But I think it's too early to say for sure. But it's interesting to see, and that's certainly something you'd miss if you just looked at, a 0.2 effect size. Let's see. I think another interesting thing that you would miss if you only looked at the sort of analyses and didn't read into the studies, and this is more about performance, is that there are now 4 studies looking at combining a full range of motion and a partial range of motion versus just using a full range of motion or just using a partial range of motion. So combining different ranges of motion and looking at strength gains with either a full range of motion or a partial range of motion. And specifically in those 4 studies, you generally see the same or slightly better strength gains when you combine different ranges of motion versus just using one, right? It's not a super large effect and it's not super consistent, but there may be a benefit if you're going for strength and performance gains to including both some full range of motion training and some partial range of motion training, but mostly being specific to the outcome that you're training for. I think those are kind of the main findings that I find interesting besides regional hypertrophy and just seeing that lengthened partials might offer a benefit.
Gotcha. Cool. I want to double tap on that calf study to kind of go on a small tangent about just statistics and maybe sharing with like lay people a little bit of wisdom. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was either the medial or the lateral gastroc, there was no statistically significant difference between long length partials and full length. But if you look at the outcome, there was like twice as much growth in the long length group. And I think the p-value was like 0.06 or something. And I know I've listened to you talk about, I forget which one it is, if it's Basval or if it's Eanes. One of them was, I think it was Basval, it's a systematic review where there weren't any statistically significant differences when increasing volumes, but there was a trend, and you still take that as being kind of useful for applying and judging whether or not increasing volumes are better for muscle growth. So can you kind of clarify or maybe explain p-values and how you kind of take that into account when you're assessing the results of a study?
Sure. So I'm going to give a brief statistics, introduction. So when you're doing what we call null hypothesis significance testing, which is essentially when you use p-values to see whether or not a difference was statistically significant. It's what most sports science studies use nowadays, although that is slowly changing. What you essentially do is you set something called an alpha level, which is the likelihood that you deem acceptable that the findings or the difference you observe is due to chance, right? So it's not a real difference, it's simply due to random noise in your study. For almost all studies, not by some well-considered reason, but rather just by convention, and in fact, the reason most studies set it at 0.05 or 5% chance that the difference you observe between two groups or two conditions is due to random noise, that 5% convention is literally based on the original author talking about this sort of stuff, saying, oh, for example, you could use 5%, but you really have to consider it for your own study and the context of your own study. And people are like, okay, 5% it is, and then everyone started doing 5%. It's not like it's well considered. And in fact, it should probably be appropriate to what you're studying. Because like, if you're a sport coach, right, and you're interested in, even if there's a chance this effect doesn't exist, but I want to make sure I don't miss on any potential effects, you may want to set that quite a bit higher, because then you find effects even if there's a chance that they don't really exist. But at least you're kind of on the, okay, well, either they exist and I get a benefit, or they don't exist and I don't lose anything, right? So depending on your field of study, as opposed to, for example, like pharma, where the wrong drug might cause a lot of issues and you want to minimize the chance of it just being ineffective, right? Depending on your field, you don't just want to set an alpha level at 5% chance that the results are merely a result of random noise. However, in sports science, because most sports scientists don't really think about their methods very much, most of them just set it at 5%, right? It's just a convention. And so in this study, for example, the alpha level, or the likelihood that you deem acceptable that the results are due to random noise, was set at 0.05. And so if the p-value, essentially the likelihood that the results observed are due to random noise, is below 0.05, we deem it statistically significant, or we see a statistically significant difference in favor of one group or the other. Now, the calculation for p-value involves a few things. Two of the most important things are the magnitude of difference between two groups on average, right? So for example, if one group saw an improvement in calf size of 5% and another of 10%, that is incorporated into how we calculate p-values. However, another thing that's incorporated is variance. So essentially, in the improvement in each group, was there a lot of like individual differences? So for example, did one individual in one group gain like 20% and other individuals like 0%, or was it quite like tight-knit, where most people saw a benefit and it was maybe between 12 and 8% on average, or most of the time? That is also incorporated. So the degree of variance or individual response in improvement is also incorporated into how we calculate those p-values. And so there's a few things that go into calculating p-values, but the important thing is that, do we really think, based on this, that a p-value of 0.051 and a p-value of 0.049 are that different, and that we should dichotomously interpret these findings? That if it's 0.051, and maybe there's like a 0.2% difference in the average improvement in that group, do we really think that's such a different outcome to it being 0.049? Or should we rather interpret most findings as being on a continuum from sort of lending no credibility or support to the idea that there's an effect here, or a lot of support to it, overwhelming support? I think, and I think this is the way that hopefully sports science is kind of turning towards, that findings should be interpreted not dichotomously, but rather probabilistically. And that's where, for example, Bayesian stats come in that they allow you to make more educated guesses as to what the likelihood of this having an effect and how large that effect is, as opposed to just interpreting it dichotomously. Long story short, just because a finding is or isn't significant doesn't mean you should assume that it exists or doesn't exist. Rather, you should see what the p-value is, see what the percentage improvements are, and see it in light of other evidence to see whether you think there might be something going on. Simply viewing it dichotomously in a black and white fashion is not the way to go for it.
Gotcha. And for anyone who's listening and super lost, I'll just say, I guess the point is that science is generally probabilistic in that when we do a study and we have an outcome, we don't prove with certainty that X is better than Y. And a p-value of 5 just means, 0.05 means that we're 95% confident that the results actually occurred because of what we tested and it wasn't just because of chance. And a p-value of 0.06 means that we're 94% confident and the joke I was getting at, or what was kind of funny, was that in that study there was almost twice as much difference, but in theory, technically, it wouldn't have been viewed as statistically or meaningful because the statistical significance was 94% versus 95.
Yeah, it's interesting because on the one hand, you have to respect the idea that people set out criteria by which they will interpret results, and then they have to follow those because otherwise, it's essentially like you say, for example, you make a guess or a bet that this will happen. Like, for example, the roulette will land on red 16. And then it lands on black 16. And then after it's landed, you're like, I said black 16 all along, right? That will kind of throw some shade onto your ability to make hypotheses and make educated guesses. And you want to stand by what you originally set out to do. And I think that I can understand people's, like, if I ever say, oh, this result wasn't significant, but I think there's something here, some people will say, like, that's not how stats work. And it's like, I get where you're coming from, but equally, we need to realize that these things do work on, as you said, more of a probabilistic thing than on a dichotomous way of thinking.
Yeah, and clearly you would be kind of moving your goalposts because you're getting paid lots of money by Long Length Range of Motion Corporation, and you're completely biased in that regard.
You have no idea, man. Big, long muscle length, it's been treating me well. I'm, living in a 1,000 square feet apartment right now. It's beautiful, incredible lifestyle. Would recommend.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. Now back to the script that they have you reading. Do you think that there are any differences between different muscle groups in terms of how useful long length partials are? I know I've seen you talk about how for some muscle groups, the long length portion of the movement, or for some exercises, the long length portion of the movement is already more difficult than the short length. And for other movements, it's the opposite. Could you maybe explain why that's the case and what your takeaways are there?
For sure. So I think there's a few ways to go about this. One, you could simply look at the direct empirical evidence and look at which muscle groups have we actually studied, and do those studies find a benefit in favor of lengthened training. And I think that's a very solid way of going about it. Ultimately, though, it is always going to be limited by the fact that we don't have studies on all exercises in all muscle groups. So we have to make some inferences. And if we make inferences, we have to base those off of, or inferences are essentially assumptions that the results in this study will apply to your training, right? Now, when we make those assumptions or inferences, we have to base them off of things that seem to be repeatable principles or consistent principles. And one of those things is, if a movement is already functionally a lengthened partial, then switching it to being more of a lengthened partial is not going to make much of a difference biomechanically, right? So if you're taking a dumbbell pullover, right, or a dumbbell fly, which is already a partial for the lats and for the chest respectively, which already has a very heavily biased resistance curve, where the hardest part of that movement in a dumbbell pullover is when the moment arm, or the distance between the axis of rotation, aka your shoulder, and the weight is largest, right, is already the bottom position, or the lengthened position. And so whether you now choose to cut out the top 25% of the range of motion or not, there's essentially nothing going on there. You're not really changing the movement. And so whether you do a full range of motion or a lengthened partial is overwhelmingly unlikely to make a big difference in your hypertrophy. However, in some cases, like most back training, say for the pullover, like most rowing variations, most pull-down variations or pull-up variations, most bicep training as well has kind of mid to shortened biased resistance curve. A lot of side delt training. Those muscle groups tend to have the hardest part of the lift occur when your muscles are quite shortened. So if we cut that point of the lift out and we instead just do the lengthened part, you'll probably be able to use substantially more weight. And you'll be able to make that lengthened position a lot more challenging and stimulating. And so I think for those muscle groups, theoretically, not something we've observed directly empirically, like we have a few studies on the biceps, we have 0 studies on the back, we have 0 studies on the side delts, but at least theoretically, based on these principles that we have and these assumptions we can make, I would say those are the muscle groups where it makes the most difference. Equally, because we have observed differences in muscle groups that I wouldn't think are quite as likely to benefit. Like, for example, the hamstrings have benefited. In an RDL, or in a multi-hip machine rather, in a study that hasn't been published yet, the hamstrings and glutes have benefited. So there does seem to be the scope for muscle groups that are usually also trained with a full range of motion pretty hard in a lengthened position to still benefit from lengthened partials, even if the resistance curve offers some challenge in that lengthened position, there might still be a benefit. But I think it's going to be largest in the muscle groups that otherwise do not get much challenge or resistance in the lengthened position.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't have much results to show for it yet, but I have definitely felt a big difference in my side delts, particularly. I think, especially even just going from dumbbells to cables without using kind of a deeper stretch, you notice a bigger difference because with dumbbells in like a lateral raise, you feel almost nothing until you're already past the lengthened position. But using cables to not only load that lengthened position, but also let the weight kind of drag my arm behind me, I felt a big difference, at least just anecdotally, from like a pump and how much I'm feeling my side delts with kind of integrating or utilizing some of the long length partial stuff.
Hey man, that's awesome. It's ultimately really hard to tell in practice whether any of these things work, which throws further shade on the idea that you should just do what the successful bodybuilders around you do, because oftentimes small details about their training are going to have much less of an effect than, hey, they have great genetics, they're on P.h.D s, they have a low stress lifestyle because they're bodybuilding for a living. Like a lot of these things are going to play a much bigger role, and so you can't really tell if you're having better results due to lengthened partials or for range of motion, just like you can't tell if someone else is having better results because they're turning their pinkies in on the chest press. So yeah, that is part of the challenge, but anecdotally, I don't think I've gotten smaller over the past year. I think I have gotten larger, which at least tells me that it's not killing my gains.
Gotcha. And I've seen you talk a little bit about how long length partials or the stretched position impacts glute growth. And I've listened to Brett Contreras talk about this a little bit, the glute guy. And I heard him say he's generally in favor of the long length philosophy or idea for his upper body and stuff like that, but thinks that there might be something different for the glutes and maybe the lower body. Do you have any takes on that? I know there was one study where it compared squats to hip thrusts directly, and there was no difference in glute growth, where I guess technically compared to like the hamstring study by Mao and the tricep study, where using a more lengthened position from the start, not necessarily using lengthened partials, led to better outcomes. You would, I guess, in theory, expect the squat to do better. So I don't know what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'll say is that you're very clued in. Like, you've read your stuff. I've actually spoken to Brett about this before. I don't personally buy into it. I don't think that the glutes are special in some regard. The rationale, I think, for Brett stems from, and I don't want to speak for him, but I think this is what I've gathered from speaking with him, is that if you look at some data on internal leverages for different hip extensors, as you go from your hips being highly flexed, your hips being more extended, there's some evidence that the gluteus maximus, for example, has better leverage when your hips are nearly fully extended, whereas when your hips are more flexed, which is the lengthened position for the glutes, they have worse leverage internally than the adductor muscle, for example, the adductor magnus. And so based on that, and your body generally probably trying to be somewhat efficient, at least in some maximal tasks, it may choose to recruit more so the adductor when it comes to hip extension in a lengthened position, but more so the glutes when it comes to hip extension in a shortened position. Now, I don't think that's a very compelling rationale, because when you're performing resistance training to failure, those differences in internal leverage play much less of a role, because your body has to recruit all muscle groups involved for that function. If you're doing to failure, by definition, you won't be able to produce enough force to overcome the resistance. And so your body will recruit all muscle groups responsible for that function, whether they have slightly worse internal leverage or slightly better internal leverage. In the case of the study you mentioned comparing squats and hip thrusts, there's a few reasons why I do see it. And again, going back to the probabilistic thing, right? Just like studies support for a notion are probabilistic, their applicability to a given question is also on a spectrum from not being applicable whatsoever to being extremely controlled and internally valid in terms of looking at the question that you're trying to answer. In this case, I think it kind of falls in between the two, where it is comparing ultimately an exercise that places the glutes in a more lengthened position versus in a more shortened position, and an exercise like the squat in this case that is placing more tension in a lengthened position and less so in a shortened versus the opposite in the case of a hip thrust. So there is that component, but we are ultimately, in contrast to many range of motion studies and muscle length studies, talking about two different exercises. And that does introduce some confounders. Like, for example, we are talking about a cohort of participants that were relatively untrained and that when taking a set to failure might be less inclined to take it to true failure when it comes to failing a squat versus failing a hip thrust. There's the idea also that the squat and hip thrust differ, that on the basis of the squat involves the quads. It involves other muscle groups like your lower back a little bit more. So it may just have been that those muscle groups reached failure first, right? And they're responsible for different muscle functions, and that thus the glutes didn't get a completely maximally effective stimulus compared to the hip thrust, where the glutes and adductors are going to be by far the primary movers. So that's kind of my thoughts on that study, and I think it's worth noting that when you look at the other study I mentioned earlier, where essentially they compared a full range of motion on the multi-hip machine to doing lengthened partials. So they were comparing, I think, 90 degrees of hip extension, so going from 90 degrees of hip flexion to just your hips being neutral, to doing just the bottom half of that movement, so going from 90 degrees of hip flexion to just 45 degrees of hip flexion, but they were never fully extending their hips. They saw more glute hypertrophy when doing the lengthened partial. And again, that study hasn't been published yet, so I'd take it with a slight grain of salt. But I think that just on the basis of its study's design, the fact that it's also within participant design, so you kind of wash away some of the noise associated with genetics, stress, sleep, PEDs, what have you. So it being within subject design, it using the same exercise, which washes away some of the confounding variables associated with using different exercises I just mentioned. I see it as stronger support. So I don't personally think the glutes are anything unique in that sense.
Gotcha. And to your point about the many additional muscle groups involved in the squat, I'm curious if they switched the design to really target the glutes using maybe more of a wider sumo squat stance or with feet pointed out, and then also maybe involving like a little mind muscle connection type stuff. I think it was actually Brett Contreras and Dr. Brad Schoenfeld who did a mind muscle connection study before and saw significantly greater growth in the biceps. I'm curious because, with a squat, depending on, especially if these are untrained people, I don't remember if it was trained or untrained, if you take people off the streets, there could be pretty large differences in how much quad involvement and glute involvement just based off of people's, regular biomechanics. So I guess what their nervous systems are used to activating when doing that type of movement. At least that's like one thing that kind of came to mind when I was thinking about all that.
Yeah, I think that's a potentially valid concern. I have some reservations when it comes to mind-muscle connection, just because it's a case of absence of evidence rather than evidence of absence for now. The study you mentioned by Schoenfeld back in 2017, I have a video on this, but basically that is the only study we have looking at the effect of the mind-muscle connection on actual hypertrophy. And so to me, the findings were relatively equivocal, but maybe there is a benefit in favor of mind-muscle connection. What I'll say is that until we have more evidence, I wouldn't bank on the mind-muscle connection being a predominant factor in influencing results. And I think that, for example, when you look at a lot of the mechanistic evidence on why a mind-muscle connection would, for example, impact hypertrophy, like differences in activation in different muscle groups and what have you, it may be a lot more relevant in certain contexts, like, for example, when you're lifting with a very controlled tempo. Whether you're focusing on the mind-muscle connection or not might play a role in how much activation you get in different muscles. However, if you're using a relatively explosive concentric, for example, so relatively explosive lifting phase, which you probably should based on the evidence we have, those differences in activation wash away. And so even mechanistically, in reasonable circumstances, I'm not sure that focusing on the muscle connection makes a huge difference, but I'm open to the possibility that, hey, the mind-muscle connection is something that people should focus on. I would just say that we don't have the evidence yet to know for sure.
Yeah. And to be fair, I think in that study, only the biceps saw a benefit. I think it was quads and leg extension didn't see one.
That is correct. And as far as pretty much every other variable besides bicep thickness, pretty much every other variable was in favor of the other group that focused on the cue, get the weight up, as opposed to squeeze the muscle. So that's why I don't see it as particularly strong evidence. But it could be that it just failed to detect differences. I don't know.
Gotcha. Is 10 a hard cutoff for you, or?
Yes, it is.
Okay, gotcha. Well, with that said, thank you very much for sitting down and talking to me. I really enjoyed everything we covered and got some good insight from, expertise in this one area. It's pretty cool. Where can people find you if they want to check out your content or any of your coaching services or anything like that?
For sure, man. I appreciate it. Honestly, like this has been one of my favorite podcasts so far. It's been awesome because you're very clued in. If you want to find me, you can find me where I'm most active nowadays, which is on YouTube at Wolf Coaching. I've been putting a lot of work into that, upgrading everything as far as the information goes, as far as the video quality goes. That will be coming out soon as well. Just a lot of work in the background, and you'll find a lot of information there on how to best train according to the science, essentially, and how to best eat and all your practices. And then you can also find me on Instagram at Wolf Coach. That's my last name and coach. You can find all my research if you just type in Milo Wolf ResearchGate onto Google. And then finally, you can find my written information like articles, a newsletter, and coaching at wolfcoaching.com.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely recommend the YouTube stuff, like we were talking about a little bit before we started. I've been watching that a lot lately. And also, I do get your newsletter, and very concise, which is nice, that you're able to kind of squeeze all of, whatever, maybe hours of reading, whatever goes into that, just, what you need to make use of that information. Anyways,
Thank you, man. I appreciate that.
all right, that wraps it up for my conversation with Dr. Wolf. I do strongly recommend you go check out some more of his content, as I've found his YouTube videos and his newsletter really useful. Also, if you want to check out some more of Shortcut U's content, you can go to shortcutu.substack.com and you'll see all of the content I've posted there, everything I've written on different health and fitness topics over the past year or two. I'll leave a link for that in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this podcast, and I'll consider doing some more with some other experts like Dr. Wolf.